My name is autistic. You only need to know my first name because Icelanders don't use surnames. And I'm a clinical psychologist in Reykjavik, Iceland. A little bit about myself. I have a BA in English. I have a diploma in computer studies. And then I went into psychology. I did a BSc in psychology. I have CANSIC in psychology, which is a Scandinavian degree for clinical psychologists. I then added a diploma in disability studies, and I've run a psychological service for autistic people from the year 2014. Now, a little bit about my client group. My client group is mainly autistic people from the age of 14 to about 70 years old. It includes all genders, all sexual orientations, all employment statuses, all levels of education. People have mild learning disability to being gifted. 1/3 of my clients come from vocational rehabilitation, and some of them stay on with me. About 1/3 of my clients come to me as short-term clients, and about 1/3 come to me as a long-term clients. I'm here to talk a little bit about CBT and how it works for autistic people. And we should start with the research. Nowadays, the simplest way to know what the research says is simply to ask GPT. And so it did that. And I asked him, or it, how useful it is, how useful CBT is for autistic people. And I got the reply, cognitive behavioral therapy can be a useful treatment approach for autistic people. It has been found to be effective in reducing anxiety, depression, and obsessive compulsive behaviors in people with autism, as well as improving social skill, communications, and overall functioning. Now, this chatbot, though it is intelligent, it only echoes what we, the humans, believe. So let's take a look at the research, starting with children. We have many studies on CBT for anxiety in autistic children. We have fewer on other disorders. But because we have so many papers on CBT for anxiety in autistic children, it's easy to do a good meta-analysis. And I will start with a recent meta-analysis, which is Sharma from 2021. And it says it works. The clinician measure it, and they say it works. The parents say it works. The children say it doesn't work. And in the paper, they say, given that the children, young people themselves are reporting little change in their anxiety, it might be tempting to think that either they are reluctant or somehow unable to identify their anxiety, and that the adults' ratings are more accurate. And this discrepancy between the results of CBT between clinicians and parents and children has been reported for years. And it is what we expect to see in a research. Now let's take a look at systematic review from Bang et al. From 2021. They came to the same conclusion, that there is no significant effect on symptoms of social emotional problems based on self-reported outcomes, whereas if somebody else reports, there is an effect, CBT has effect. But from this, they actually make a very interesting conclusion. They conclude that CBT may significantly improve the symptoms of autism and social emotional problems in children or adolescents with autism, even though the children and the adolescents do not report any improvement. There's a further complication Levy and all just published a meta-analysis of relapse rates in CBT for anxiety and related disorders in youth. And this meta-analysis, they were not just looking at people with autism, they were just looking at all youths. But what they did was that they found out that the relapse rate for for people with autism was so high that they omitted them. There were only two that they included. It was the cells in 2014, and McNally-Keane, and they had 44% and 20% relapse rate, respectively. Now, if we summarize what the researchers think, they think autistic children are anxious. We treat them using CBT. They get better. But because they're autistic, they don't realize that their anxiety has improved. But everybody, the adults, see the difference. And, you know, studies don't generally measure relapse, so we don't have to worry about it. There is, however, another explanation, which is absolutely more frightening, that autistic children are anxious. We treat them using CBT. They learn to mask their anxiety, so the adults believe that they are improved. When the masking wears off, the adults see the anxiety again and believe it is a relapse, and therefore that the relapse is the relapse of the masking. And this, of course, raises an ethical question. If children's feelings are not an important outcome of therapy, why do we send them to therapy? I will not try to answer this, but it is an important ethical question in studies of autistic children and anxiety. Now, if we go to adults, there are not many studies on how effective CBT is, but we will go through some recent reviews. Linton and al. just published a systematic review, and they conclude that some forms of CBT may improve, may decrease anxiety and depression scores in some autistic children and adults. They say some form, and they say scores. They do not say decrease anxiety and depression in some autistic children and adults. And they say at present, due to limitations associated with the quality of evidence, we are unable to agree with researchers who conclude that CBT is an effective intervention for all autistic people. And they also mentioned, which is unusual, that they say lack of reporting around potential harms and meditation side-related effects is problematic in light of the fact that a large proportion of participants in mindfulness-based interventions can experience negative side effects. They do mention that the meditation part may be harmful, but they do not mention anything about the CBT itself being harmful, and they don't seem to believe that it could be. Another recent study is McMahon, where they looked at hospitalizations among adolescents and young adults. And they concluded that mental health care for autistic people has not improved in decades, and quote these studies. So what are the current recommendations for autistic people with mental problems? And I mean, obviously we turn to the NICE recommendations, and they say that we should use psychosocial dimensions according to specific disorder. That is, we should not make a distinction between autistic people and non-autistic people. We should just look at the disorder. And the NICE recommendations for disorders tend to be CBT. But NICE has recommendations how to modify CBT, and by including adaptation to CBT and not to the other therapies, it is kind of implied that it is an important therapy for autistic people. Furthermore, applications for adaptations for CBT are only on delivery methods, except for one point. And they say that that point is placing greater emphasis on changing behavior rather than cognition, and using behavior as starting point for intervention. Now, there is a problem, because when they mention behavior, when they mention adaptation to CBT, and they talk about behavior, they're talking about behavior within CBT theory, that is, within CBT models. They're not talking about just any behavior, because they're talking about something that is within CBT models. So, what we know is that cognitive therapy is frequently recommended for autistic people, but because we're talking about behavior within models and we're talking about cognitions within CBT models, we have to ask, can the models used in cognitive therapy describe the autistic experience? And it's an important question, because if they can't describe the autistic experience, they're likely to point to the wrong targets in treatment. So now we're on to a fundamental question that is really asked, and that is, can CBT models describe the autistic experience? But before we look at cognitive models, let's look at what autistic people say about CBT. Here's a quote from the Scottish Survey of Autistic Adults' Experience of Counselling. For me, a CBT focus in itself is unhelpful. All it does is point out more things I should be masking, and teaches me to put more effort into masking rather than understanding myself and others properly. It taught me that the things I do and think are wrong, which increased my anxiety and convinced me that I was making up my feelings and problems. And here I have a quote from a client of mine who says, I call CBT the therapy where you look at yourself in a mirror and lie to yourself. And another client of mine said, in CBT, I learned a lot of new technical words. After CBT, I had the feeling that there was something more wrong with me. I felt that I was doing something wrong. From this, we can actually see that at least some autistic people who have done CBT actually feel worse afterwards, and that they feel that there is something more wrong with them. But now, back to CBT models. Now, in cognitive therapy, they're all based on the cognitive triad, where thoughts, feelings, and behavior all affect each other. And this is the basis of all cognitive therapy. And we can see that most of this actually happens within the mind of the person, their thoughts and feelings and their behavior that we can visualize. But missing from this triad is the environment. There is no sensory stimuli, there's no interpersonal relations, and there is no interoception. Now, this was problematic. Well, no, let me not go on to that quite yet. And we can see, this is mainly within the thought patterns of the individual. And even some new autistic models ignore the environment. Here we have a model by South and Rogers from 2017, which is about intolerance of uncertainty in autism. And if you take a look at it, it all happens within the mind of the autistic person. There is a typical sensory function, there is alexithymia, there is rigidity of thought, restricted repetitive behavior, thoughts of behavior, anxiety symptoms, and intolerance of uncertainty. There is no environment. It is just all taking place within the mind of the autistic person. But it was early on that people sort of realized that the environment must come into CBT models. And Greenbaker and Padetsky added the environment in 1995. And it's in this model the environment, facts, thoughts, physical sensations. They've also added physical sensations, behavior and feelings. It affects everything. So they sort of solve that problem. But how does it work for an autistic person? And let's try a very simple problem. And it's an autistic person that gets grumpy when they're hungry, and they don't realize that they're hungry until they are in a meltdown. Now let's apply this to this very simple model. And at stage 1, the person doesn't notice hunger. There is hunger, but there's no thought about the hunger. The behavior is unfriendly, even aggressive. They feel grumpy, irritated, and they're thinking people are annoying me. They're not thinking about the hunger because they can't sense it. Now, at stage 2, they're in a meltdown. There's a hunger. They cannot think about anything else except the hunger. They're out of control. And the situation has escalated. You know, the problem that we come across with this representation, which is in 2 stages, is that which one are we going to use to put to treatment? Stage 1, if you're not aware of the problem, how can you respond to it? CBT is not likely to work. So we can ignore a little bit stage 2, then we can go to stage 2. And the person is out of control, so the obvious solution is to manage your feeling according to some cognitive therapy, doesn't matter what. But none of these point to the obvious solution, which is to eat regularly. So at least for this simple problem, we cannot use CBT to point to the obvious solution. Now let's try another famous model. This is the social anxiety model by Clark and Wells, where there's a social situation which activates assumptions, which activates perceived social danger, which makes people process themselves as a social object, and also the perceived social dangers call for safety behaviors and somatic and cognitive symptoms. Right. And this is basically still sort of the standard model for social anxiety. Now, if we just take a look at social situations for autistic people, they involve sensory stimuli, and usually a lot of it, because where people are, there is noise, there is light, there's a lot going on, there's movement. Another fact is that autistic people often find people who don't share their interests boring. That is usually the majority of the world, because they may have special interests. They would not be called special if they were that common. And also, autistic people deal with poor processing speed and working memory, which has an effect on social situations, because poor processing speed and working memory leads to difficulties in following conversations and difficulties in thinking about what you're supposed to say at the same time, which means that autistic people have difficulty in expressing themselves in situations which would demand processing speed and working memory, which again means that they can't be themselves in difficult social situations. And these things can actually create anxiety for autistic people. They're going into a situation that is really difficult for them, not because they're anxious about sort of how other people view them, but because they actually have other problems than neurotypicals. But how do we fit these autistic elements into these models if we are going to deal with social anxiety? I can't find, I have not been able to find a way to put them into this model. Now, the general sort of idea is that you confront your fears and your fears will disappear. But sending people into social situations again and again won't solve these problems. You will not get better processing speed and working memory by going again and again into social situations. The sensory difficulties will not disappear, and people will definitely not get more interesting. So what happens is that as autistic people go again and again and again into social situations, and they're being told that their fears will disappear, they will actually ask to start questions such as, why doesn't this work? This is supposed to work, or the research says it's supposed to work. And they start to question themselves, what's wrong with me? And therefore the problems are likely to increase. Now, I will only take one more model, which is the Beck's cognitive triad for depression, where you have negative views about oneself, such as I'm worthless, negative views about the world, everybody hates me because I'm worthless, and negative views about the future, I will never be good at anything because everybody hates me. And now in therapy, we try to deal with all this, with all these thoughts. And yes, it might work, but this model doesn't take into account one important thing, and that is society's negative views about autistic people, because society's views are fueling this. Autistic people usually feel they are worthless because they have been told so. So to summarize this a little bit, there's actually a brilliant summarization on this by someone who calls themselves Daisy Girl, and I found this quote on National Autistic Society's chart. It's from 2014. The major problem for CBT is that it assumed disordered thinking, which can't be altered. Maybe sometimes the autistic way of thinking is not disordered. Maybe it's actually correct. Now, I want to, in this short chapter, to sort of look at what CBT asks autistic people to do. But before I do that, I want to share with you some videos of autistic people speaking about CBT.
So I think CBT being pushed as the only or the first line offering means that for a lot of people, they could actually be harmed by it. Because for some people, CBT is fantastic and is really, really helpful. And it's a brilliant resource for a lot of people. But I think for some people, if they go and they're forced to do a certain amount of sessions of something where they're just constantly being exposed to and told about all the things they don't like, and if that's not helpful for them, it's just going to make them turned off to the idea of getting support and, engaging with and accessing therapies on the NHS just because, well, they're like, it was a terrible experience for me, so I'm not going to even try the next time I need it. I mean, I think at a million miles an hour, and I understand everything that goes through my head, which means I find CBT quite difficult to actually engage with, because actually sitting down and having a professional point out my thoughts and my behaviours doesn't make me more likely to suddenly stop having them. So having, talking through, oh, well, here are my thoughts, here are the behaviours, here's how I can maybe change. I've already thought of all of those things. And I know that they are there, and I know that they are problematic and they should change. But I find talking about them and doing all of the worksheets not necessarily helpful. And I think it was difficult, especially when I was younger, that I wasn't able to access an alternative.
Now, I want to show what CBT sort of actually feels like, I think, for a lot of autistic people. Here we have a typical model, and we have a simple anxiety-provoking situation, and it is a non-autistic person. They have an increased heart rate, nausea, stomach ache, they worry about the situation, they worry about the physiological symptoms. The emotion are sort of fear and panic, and they start to avoid the situation. And the targets in treatment are sort of the cognitive areas and the avoidance. Now, for autistic people, this looks a little bit more like this. There is some situation going on. They don't know quite what's going on because of the interoception problems. They have some bodily sensations that they don't know exactly what are. They have many thoughts at the moment, but they don't know quite what they are because they have problems putting thoughts into words. They have the alexithymia. They have processing speed problems as such. They have some feelings. They don't know what they are. And the behavior sort of is, as I don't know what's happening, I don't know what to do. So they sort of fall into the basic response, fight, flight, fawn, faint. So what is the target here? The problem here is that there are cognitive problems, and I don't mean cognitive in the sense that is made that the cognitive therapy uses. It is actually that the brain works differently. They cannot find out what they are feeling, what they're sensing. They have problems with putting sort of thoughts in words and that sort of thing. So we have different kind of cognitive problems than CBT talks about being cognitive. And we will take a look a little bit better. Let's do this in a little bit more detail, what CBT asks autistic people to do. And to start with, they have to try to survive the sensory stimuli. There are sounds, there are lights, there's something going on. That is just the basis of their life, and that's just what they have to do. And then they have to find out what they're feeling and put words to it. Now, this is important because if they're happy and calm, they don't have to do anything. But if they're anxious, they have to do what CBT tells them. But if they can't figure out what they're feeling, then what are they supposed to do? CBT doesn't actually tell you that. Then they're supposed to find out what their bodily sensations are. They're going to figure out what they are thinking, but it's not what they are thinking, it's what they were thinking, because they were thinking long before all of this happened, because now they've had so many thoughts and they've had to do so much, that so much has happened. Then they have to remember what they're supposed to do. What was I actually told in therapy to do? And this is difficult because there are actually a lot of memory problems for people with autism. It's not often spoken about, but they do have difficulty remembering what they're supposed to do. And of course, if they remember what to do, they're supposed to do it. But what if they don't remember what they were told in therapy? Then what? So it puts much more on autistic people than non-autistic people because of the way the brain works. And this all is putting an enormous pressure on processing speed and memory. And then we come again to reevaluating your thoughts. CBT is all about reevaluating your thoughts. But there is a problem there. Because autistic people have had their thoughts and beliefs doubted since they could talk. It is the most common experience of all autistic people. They are constantly doubted. No, it is not hot in here. No, it's not noisy. No, you're not angry. We will go to that in a bit more detail later on. And there is also another problem because many autistic people in therapy have been questioning their thoughts and feelings every day. And they claim it's anxiety provoking. This is just what they do. Am I thinking this correctly? Am I supposed to feel this way? And they describe this, this is fueling their anxiety. And now they go to therapy and the therapist tells them, you should question yourself more. And it is just a fact that constantly questioning your personal experience is going to lead to anxiety. And also, it can increase self-blame. Therapy is often, and CBT is often about changing people. And I want to show you a clip about a woman who actually says that.
I was diagnosed with ADHD first and then autism a bit later, and there was a period of time in between when I actually accessed some services that were inappropriate for me, and it wasn't until my autism diagnosis that I was able to better understand what my needs were and then access other services. So essentially I've taken up some time of psychological services in between when I really didn't need to access that because it was inappropriate for me. I don't respond well to, say, cognitive behaviour therapy, for example, because some of the things that might want to work on and change are just part of my natural neurology and part of my natural being.
So at least some autistic people feel that that CBT is trying to change them. And there is another problem with focusing on feelings and thoughts. Special interest is a part of autism. It's not something that autistic people can stop or snap out of. Once you have a special interest, you have a special interest. And nobody has found a way to stop it. And it can be detrimental when people focus too much on their thoughts and feelings, because it can actually become their special interest. They will actually think about nothing else. And they will try to, they will find sort of every possible situation that they were anxious in. And of course, a normal person is anxious several times a day. It's a normal feeling. But if you over focus on it, it can actually increase the anxiety. And when sort of feelings and thoughts, when therapy, finding all the problems becomes a special interest, it can create huge problems. Sometimes when we see clients like that, they're called obsessive or even hypochondriacs, if it's sort of physical symptoms that they are focused on. But it doesn't always help to focus on feelings and thoughts. There is a further problem with CBT, because if we take a look at it, in CBT, wrong diagnosis means a wrong model and wrong treatment. And I will show you examples of this. We have depression versus burnout. In depression, we want behavioral activation. We want people to do things. We want people to sort of experience something nice. We want them to be positive. But in a burnout, we just want people to rest. They will recover. So if we diagnose burnout as depression, we are actually using the wrong treatment. And this is actually very common for autistic people, that they are told to go outside to do things when they are in a burnout. We have the social anxiety versus the autistic social style. Autistic people socialize and engage in conversation differently from non-autistic people. So if we don't realize this, we will actually have the situation where we will send people into situations which they cannot cope with. And the anxiety is not going to go away, it's going to increase. So again, CBT, if we don't have the right diagnosis, CBT can make things worse. Another thing, a classical thing, is anger and meltdown. I've had many clients who want sort of to learn how to deal with their anger, and they don't have anger issues. They have sensory difficulties leading to meltdowns. They've just been told by society that this is an anger problem. And then we have the difficulty of diagnosing phobia versus post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, in phobia, we have to expose people to the danger, which isn't really a danger. But in post-traumatic stress disorder, we never want to expose people to similar events. We don't send people who have been attacked and ask them, you know, you should get attacked more often, you know, it's good for you. We don't do that. And this diagnosis, for instance, becomes really difficult when it comes to school refusal, because some of the children have actually developed post-PSD. Whoa, I'm not doing this well, but they've experienced trauma during therapy and during all the attempts to go to school. So, but we sort of tend to see it more as a phobia, as they are frightened of something that isn't really frightening. And I want to show you here how, you know, differential diagnosis actually matters. And here's another quote from the Scottish Service of Autistic Adults Experiences. There were multiple telephone assessments. This is an issue as I'm quite flat and to the point. Without NVCs, that dullness is usually taken to be depression. It's not, it's my normal. And even the differential diagnosis between autism and normal matters. And it's quite common in my experience that autistic people are diagnosed as being depressed. And again, they're not listened to, because autistic people, of course, you know, don't know how to fill out these forms. They don't know if they're depressed or not. It's the non-autistic people who are better at judging them. So they get the wrong treatment. And I actually just spoke about a client had a diagnosis of depression yesterday, a client who's just refuses to have ever been depressed, and I actually believe her. So to summarize so far, therapy based on these models can be unhelpful when models point to the wrong targets in therapy. They can increase problems when models point to the wrong targets in therapy, increase self-blame when people blame themselves when therapy doesn't work. And they can also increase anxiety because the situation never gets easier. It teaches you to doubt your feelings, your thoughts, and such. So in my view, CBT can actually be sort of slightly harmful. I now want to jump for a quick moment back to basics. And I want to remind you, you know, what is depression? We all quote sort of DSM or something like that. But what is depression, sort of, when people speak about it? And it is something like, you know, a feeling of sadness or emptiness with the feeling that this will not change but last forever. It's sort of hopelessness. And we can actually sort of replace the word feeling with perception, that people perceive that they are sad or that the world is empty. Okay, and what is anxiety? Anxiety is the perceived difficulty of the task plus perceived support is greater than your perceived capability in a task that's perceived to be important. It doesn't matter if the task is insignificant, then people just don't care. So some disorders are essentially disorders of perception. These could, for instance, include the phobias and OCD, and phobias, people in sort of, you know, people who are afraid of wasps. They perceive them as being really, really dangerous, whereas they aren't. And in OCD, that again, there is a similar sort of perception of that something frightful will happen. Most people with these disorders realize at least partly that the fear is non-logical. But others' disorder, there's sort of a mix of perception and reality. for example, anxiety and depression. People are not always anxious because there's no reason to be, or depressed because, you know, there's no reason to be. So in therapy sort of deals with these elements. You know, the cognitive therapies sort of tend to deal with perception. You're perceiving it wrong, and we will correct your perception. Sensory adjustments deal with a difficulty of a task, really, by, you know, making it a little bit more quiet, dimming the lights and that sort of thing. In school, the school work becomes easier. The support is usually dealt with through family therapy or social services, and the capability is often dealt with speech therapy, occupational therapy, or behavioral therapy. There is, however, a problem with the capability that we tend to teach neurotypical capability and not sort of you're supposed to socialize in a neurotypical way, you're supposed to do things the neurotypical way. But generally, we don't deal with the importance of a task, and I will come to all of this later. I will leave this now, and I will go in a completely different direction, but I will come back to these elements during that. And first of all, I want to take a look at common childhood experiences for autistic people, and I will take some examples. I want to point out that these experiences are so common that you don't really have to talk to autistic people about them. You just know that this has happened to them. And let's take an autistic child who complains of too much noise in school. And it says it's too noisy. And what the child really means is that it can't handle the situation, it needs help. And the adult replies, no, it's not too noisy, which gives the reply, you do not need help. This is all a mistake, and the child will not receive any help. And what the child learns is that people will not help in difficult situations. And it will also learn that it's repeatedly forced into difficult situations by adults who claim that these situations are really easy and everybody can handle them. Another example, a child says, you shouted at me. And what the child is saying is, really, I feel bad because you're mad at me. And this is a sensory issue. When autistic children sort of hear people sort of being annoyed, they sense it as a change in volume. And the adult immediately says, I wasn't shouting at you. And the message is, you created a problem. You're not supposed to feel bad in this situation. And the child's feelings are ignored. Yet another example. The child says, I can't do, it doesn't matter what it is, it just says it can't do it. And the adult says, of course you can. And the adult is meaning to be encouraging. But the meaning that the autistic child gets is, you're not telling the truth. And yet another example, child that does something unacceptable in a meltdown or an anxiety attack, and the adult says, try to control your anger. And the child is not taught the right name for their emotion, and they're taught the wrong solution. Because if it was a meltdown, we should prevent the situations. If it is an anxiety attack, maybe the child should have sought support before. But what the child is taught is that it's anger and it should try to control the feelings. And the consequences of this, it's generally accepted that children need safety, stability, and unconditional love. But what happens when children are raised without feeling safe, when these situations are so commonplace that they can't even count them? what many people call, sort of use the word complex trauma for the situation when children are not safe in their childhood. There is a problem with this because it is defined on ICD-11 because the events have to be threatening or horrific nature, which it's difficult to apply these to these sort of minor aggression. But there is, however, this part that these aggressions sort of are prolonged and they're repetitive. But many people will argue that these situations are so small that they don't count, but they are extremely frequent. So I sort of tend to use the word CPTSD for this when children are gaslighted and not helped and their feelings are doubted. There is, you know, it can be argued that it shouldn't be. But I want to show you my model, which sort of explains the situation that children end up in. They are constantly gaslighted. Their feelings and sensations are labeled in neurotypical terms, and the children's experiences are rejected. And therefore they learn that it's useless to express feelings or sensations. And they also learn that people can't be trusted. People are not helping them. People are telling them that their experiences are wrong, etc., etc. They also have frequent negative experiences, and they just learn that no one protects me. People cannot be relied on. Now, they have limited resources to respond to this, but the main response is just they pretend to be neurotypical. They learn masking. But that has consequences. It means that they lose their identity because they're constantly acting and they're not learning about themselves. It means that there is less gaslighting and more acceptance by neurotypical people, but it creates more anxiety and emotional problems. A small proportion can solve this problem by trying to be more visibly autistic. It means that if people can see that they're autistic, they might make fewer demands and they might sort of make adjustments for them. They get more support, but they're not accepted in the society. But in order to use this solution, you have to have an autism diagnosis. Otherwise, people will just think that you're weird, strange, something. You should be different. And the third solution is just to isolate yourself to avoid adverse events. These are things that can actually lead to school avoidance and such. But children grow up to be adults. So what happens to adults that come from this background? Now, we'll start here. We'll start with a person who's actually managed to make it to adulthood and has a reasonable life. They are not aware of the feelings and needs because they haven't been taught about them. They have been taught to have neurotypical needs and feelings and do as much masking as they can. And therefore they have a diminished capacity to respond to adverse events. These people, they're working or studying with some success by masking, but they're just getting by. They're waiting for negative events to happen. And eventually adverse events will happen because that's life. And what starts then is the question, why does this always happen to me? It is that, you know, it may be a small event, but it's the event, it's not event number 110, it's 20,706. And small events, when you come from this background, it means they have a large impact on your feelings. People don't have the resilience that they need. because they don't have the basis, they don't know themselves. And so it can be a relatively small event that can lead to autistic burnout, loss of skills with hypersensitivity, and they're incapable to mask anymore. If adverse events are too frequent, I see bitterness and even hatred towards the world, which sort of leads to isolation and withdrawal. But also some people solve this, these small negative events by isolating themselves. And this is actually the model that I work on and I do my therapy from. And I want to show you a clip, which is a little bit about where he mentions long-term survival behavior.
So I think initially how CBT is, it's displayed and it's offered and the way it's described, I think CBT is described as a very short-term sort of fix everything, where you do, 6 or 10 sessions. It's very targeted. It's very, we're going to think exactly what's happening in the moment. And then this is something that we change and then you're fine. I think, especially for a lot of autistic people, there are a lot of long-term patterns that I think is just necessarily when you grow up in an environment and you are autistic, you likely have some form of long-term survival behaviors. You have masking, you have things that have been going on for a long time. You were very likely bullied in school. You very likely have beliefs that you've held very close to your chest for a while. And I think CBT being described as something that targets things that are happening in the moment and not necessarily thinking of why these things are happening and what longer term things are sort of adding to the issues that are happening at the moment. I think that kind of just turned me off from it. That I was like, well, if you're not even going to pay attention to the reason that I am doing what I'm doing right now, then I don't know how putting a plaster over it's going to help. Because, like, the plaster means, yeah, you can't see it anymore, but, like, it's still there, it's still under, it's still getting worse. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there anymore.
Okay, and here's another quote from the Autistic Adults Experiences. And my experience with talk therapy from age 17 to 20 was traumatic. The therapist seemed very kind at first, but was constantly gaslighting me, invalidating my feelings, pressuring me to talk when I didn't want to, and first forcing her idea of normal on me. Now, I don't expect this therapist was doing anything else that he was doing with neurotypicals. They didn't feel gaslighted and such, but the experience of being constantly gaslighted means that it gets worse because it's not the first time, it's not the 1,000th times, it's countless. So here we are on to the question, what do I do in my therapy? And I will sort of go quickly through that. It's not a complete list. One of the basis in my therapy is you need to discover your needs. I don't know them. Because they have been denied the needs in childhood, they don't know their own needs. I can't tell them their needs. They're autistic, they have individual needs. And we have to remember that most autistic people are raised in families with neurotypical value systems, and society has the same value systems. And even when you see autistic people who have autistic parents, then most often the parents have adopted neurotypical value system. So they are sort of, it doesn't always help to come from an autistic family. And because they've never been taught this, they need to learn what needs they have. And they also need to learn that they have the right to have their needs and not neurotypical needs, because they often feel guilty about having needs that are different. If you remember this, what I am sort of working with there is this really important? What you are doing, or what you need to do, is it important? Do you need to do it? Think about it. If it is something that you personally don't need to do, it's just demand of neurotypical people, then it's not important. And I also work with autistic enculturation. We're always talking about psychoeducation. And psychoeducation about autism is telling people what neurotypical people know about autism, which is not going to help autistic people at all. Autistic enculturation is autism as a culture, as a different lifestyle. You can do things differently. You can have a different lifestyle. Yes, people can join online groups, supports group, but not all people want to do this. And regardless of whether people want to join online groups or support groups, it is actually important that the therapist is aware of the neurotypical biases, and that there is actually a cultural difference between autism and neurotypical people. And the therapist, I believe, must be able to question the neurotypical culture. Does this actually suit my client, or does this suit you? And here's actually a positive input from someone who said, therapy gave me the confidence to start making connections outside of sessions and ultimately allowed me to find my tribe. I firmly believe I would not be here today had I not connected with the therapist. I had virtually lost hope. Talking gave me hope, and for that I'm immensely grateful. And let's come to another point. You know, by perceiving the difficulty of a task from an autistic standpoint, you have a more realistic view of the difficulty of the task. Now, what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is the fact that autistic people find simple tasks, such as doing your homework, tidying up, or showering, really, really, really difficult. But neurotypical people always tell them this is easy. This is a piece of cake. And it means that if a task is really, really easy, you're not seeking support because it's easy. You're supposed to be able to do it without any support. But if you evaluate it from an autistic standpoint, these tasks are extremely difficult. You need support, and you should be able to get it. It changes things. And it's important to teach people to ask questions like, is this task important to me? Why? I often ask clients, why do you need to do this? Why do you have to go to the family dinner? And also another question is, can this task be done in a way that suits you? If you don't like to phone, you should try to email. You know, how do you prefer to do a task? You know, again, communicate. How do you prefer to communicate with people? How do you prefer to do your grocery shopping? Online in the evening, at weekends, or do you just want to skip it? And this is slightly different from sort of CBT, as this person mentions, where CBT sort of says that if you do things, you will get used to them. And this person says one thing that was suggested was that by doing things, you will get used to them. I understand the logic there, but I still don't like the many social interactions, and I'm 39. I've tried. My self-confidence is as low as ever. And we do tend to tell autistic people that just if you do it, it will become natural to you. But it is not true in all cases. Also, we need to ask, is there a simpler way for you to do tasks? It's important to simplify tasks because many people, autistic people, have been taught that they should be able to do things the neurotypical way. And this is really apparent when it comes to socializing. Many autistic people have been taught that they should be able to socialize in a neurotypical way. So let's just take a quick look at social interaction for autistic people. Here's a social interaction. Here's an autistic person in orange that is in a group of 4 others. There are 15 communication lines. There is light, there's environmental sounds, there's movement of people in cars, and the autistic people in this situation has to figure out what to say and how to say it. It is putting an enormous pressure on processing speed and working memory. So how do autistic people usually solve this? They withdraw from the situation. They sort of stay outside the group. And they've simplified the situation. It's only 6 communication lines. There's still light, environmental sounds, movement of people, but they've solved the problem. They don't have to figure out what they want to say and how to say it. They can just stay outside the group. And this is actually frequently misdiagnosed as social anxiety. This is just too much information. There is actually a better solution to the problem than the autistic people find here, but it's rarely recommended. And that is just to meet people, few people in a quiet, familiar place, and then you can figure out what you want to say and how to say it. But this is not generally what autistic people are taught. But this comes to this point. By doing things the way you prefer, you're changing the difficulty of the task and you're increasing your capability. Another part of my therapy, even though I have a trauma model, in most trauma therapies, people talk about the past, but healing emotional wounds will not fix your executive functioning. It just will not happen. So I tend not to dwell on the past more than is needed, also because that can become a special interest and people can become stuck in the past. And it is a certain danger that they will actually believe that if they can find every negative moment in their life and talk about it, they will somehow be healed. This is something that sort of society sort of maintains, that, you know, if you talk about the past, it will be fixed, but your whole life will be fixed. You'll have some sort of epiphany or something, but it will not solve the problems that autistic people are facing because they are actually having difficulties in the present. So we have to focus on the present, because knowing your needs when you're 5 years old is not going to help now, because our needs change with age. So, I mean, it's not going to help. And knowing your needs now will improve quality of life. And also, it's important to focus on the future, because autistic people have lots and lots of broken hopes in the past. And if they believe that maybe the dream can become true, they have hope. And also, people need to believe that something fun will happen in the future. But this can be something so simple, like getting a gerbil or getting a job or waiting for Halloween or the release of a new TV series. We don't need anything fancy. And this plays on to what depression is. Because if we can bring hope and looking forward to something, we're actually trying to prevent and minimize depression. Another part of that is important in therapy is trust. Because if people learn to trust a therapist, they conclude if there's one person who understands you or is willing to learn about you so that they can understand you, there could be others. And they can actually transfer that, that to other people. And I like this, this quote, you're not broken. You do not need to be cured of being neurodivergent. You need support, validations, and good coping skills. You need and deserve acceptance. To summarize, it is important that clients can ask themselves what they want and what they need. They need to think, is there a simple way to get it? If you break those neurotypical rules and just do it your way. But sometimes this isn't enough. And then we come back to cognitive therapy. Often autistic people have problems because they perceive the situation as being more difficult than it is. There are such things as real social anxiety. Autistic people have OCD, eating disorders, phobias, post-traumatic stress disorder, vomit phobia. In such cases, I try to do CBT without worksheets and without homework, because it's completely useless to get autistic people to do worksheets and homework. They forget about it. They have memory problems and they have executive functioning problems. So they have trouble with worksheets and homework. Oh. But I also sometimes refer to another psychologist if I believe that there's something special that has to be dealt with. All psychologists are supposed to measure everything. We're measuring. I admit I don't measure outcome. It's because lists for anxiety and depression, the wording is difficult for autistic people. I find myself often sort of, well, when you have a person filling out a list for depression, and it turns out that they're not depressed, and you're actually really, really worried about them, it's useless. It's your clinicians. You are probably more correct, because the lists aren't good enough, in my view. And then, of course, you know, if you're measuring something, we end up in the sort of clinical versus statistical difference. Yes, there's a difference, but does it make any difference to the person? So I see success in my work because, yeah, I see people graduating and getting a job. I see people going back to school. And I see people withdrawing from society and feeling happy about it. So you see, it is what makes people happy that is important. Some people want a job. Some people want to go back to school. Some people don't. Some people just want to be left alone. And it's okay if they are happy. And on that note, I will sort of say thank you. Here are my references.